All right, I think we're safe for about a minute into the call. Everyone else can start trickling as we get this going. If you're signed in, thanks for joining today. This is Draft.dev's monthly webinar series. At Draft.dev, we help organizations with their technical content marketing programs. Before we intro the topic, I'd love to intro our guests first. We're joined by Madhukar and Paul, good friends of ours here. Why don't you guys go ahead and intro your position, your organizations, and what you guys do, and then I'll intro our topic for today, if you don't mind. Let's get started with you, Paul.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Paul. I'm with Aeroslate. And my role within the company, essentially I manage or lead affiliate and influencer department, and all initiatives around those efforts. A few words about Airslate. So we have a number of different products. So the parent company, as they call it, called Airslate, we have a workflow tool that essentially allows to automate various workflows. Also, we have tools like Sign Now, which is e-signature solution, PDF filler, Doc Hub. So essentially, we kind of in document management space, trying to help all kinds of organizations to be more efficient, how they manage and process all types of workflows related to document management. If you have any additional questions about any of the tools, definitely let me know, and we'll be happy to answer.
Yeah, I dropped both of you guys' LinkedIn's in the chat there, so feel free to follow up with them. Madhukar, why don't you give us a little bit more? And you actually just started a new role, so curious to hear about.
Yeah, and nice to talk to you again, Clayton, and good to meet you, Paul. My name is Madhukar. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Sourcegraph. And prior to this, I was the CMO at Single Store, which was known as MemSQL. So my personal journey has been a developer into product manager and then finally into marketing side, which is the CMO. Sourcegraph, think of it the way I tell everybody is it's a platform for larger engineering teams to both automate as well as do AI based coding. So think of it as initially it was the glean for all your code bases. So if you have hundreds of repositories, many team members building on the applications, then Sourcegraph it started off with search. But now we have added agents. In fact, a couple of years ago, you were one of the first to add an agentic code completion called Cody. And we just released on waitlist a brand new version of that, which is agentic as well. And it does the entire thing for you, but it's in waitlist right now. So yeah, I'm not going to talk a lot more about it yet. And so yeah, that's where I am right now, and this is my third week here at Sourcegraph.
Awesome, thanks for the intro. You guys have very strong experience working with what I would say are well-known brands, so it's really relevant to our topic today. So we're really diving into branding and tech. I feel like when you talk about technical marketing these days, people are always the first thoughts are getting our documentation in line, getting our DevRel in line, technical content, building community. And I feel like sometimes branding gets often overlooked. And I always like to start conversations on these webinars about defining our subject matter, right? So I think a great starting point today is let's define what branding means to each of you guys, because it can vary depending on who you're talking to. And then what exactly is the approach to, or why is branding so important in the technical space? So let's start with those two definitions, and then we'll continue to sort of roll down the topic funnel today. Madhukar, what does branding mean to you, and why is it so important in the technical space?
Yeah, I think so. First and foremost, today I've been here, in this tech industry for a couple of decades now. And I have to say, today is probably the most crowded space that I've ever seen, whether it's developer audiences or not, but specifically for developer audiences and in generative AI, the barriers of building something new have become really, really low. So if you are in those watering holes, you see a new tool pop up like every few hours. You're not even talking about days anymore. In fact, just a few minutes ago, I saw OpenAI launched its own coding assistant. And if you look at that space itself, that I can name about 10 right now, all the way from Anthropic Claude code to, of course, the Windsurf Cursor, Klein, Tray, all of those words. So, in that, when the space becomes really commoditized, what really matters is what is differentiated. And differentiated goes back to the brand. And brand, in my mind, is not just the name or the visual branding, it is the overall experience of the product, all the way from discovery of that product to use of that product to finally even post product usage like the support. And if you were to, if I were to explain this to somebody outside of the tech world, to me, that's what I firmly believe in is the, much cliched example is Apple. There is no marketing without product, and there is no product without marketing. So, in my mind, when you go to the website and you search for the Apple laptop or whatever product you have, to the point where the packet arrives in your home and you unpack it, to the point when you first open it, to the point when you even run into an issue and open a support ticket, it's one cohesive single experience. And that is the brand. Now, so in that perspective, branding really comes down to three things: your product, the distribution, and the messaging. And the messaging has to be authentic to the product, and the distribution has to be very specific to the audience that you're going in. So, in my mind, that's like an entire chapter of things that I uh, could go on talking about for a while. But then the other thing I would point to is just like product is the I would say the underpinning to any marketing. Similarly, a lot of people say that, hey, if you build a really great product, you don't really need marketing. And this might be true for maybe the open AIs of the world, which
Mm.
releases Chat GPT and now you have 100 million users. But that's not true for 99.99% of the companies. So branding is extremely important, and especially in developer space, because people look at what others are using, and only if your experience is great, then they go and adopt it. And that builds on its own. So I'll hand it over to Paul to hear his thoughts as well.
I think that's a great summary. You hit the nail on the head there. Paul, I'm curious to hear if you have a different approach or if it means something different to you, or you're largely in agreement there.
I definitely agree with what Madhukar said, because I think he nailed a lot of really good points. And yeah, I mean, I think that um, especially in kind of product-led growth world, sometimes branding kind of gets overlooked in a way, but in reality, there is risks there, because I think your product obviously delivers an experience, and that experience shapes perception, and that perception essentially becomes your branding, intentionally or not. But I think when you think about kind of product fit, I think you have to start thinking about brand fit. Where do you fit as a brand in ecosystem, different products? And it is, as it was mentioned, that yeah, right now it's super easy to start creating new products, new tools, and eventually, it's there is great amount of saturations of different products. So how do you essentially kind of stand out? And I think there is a kind of power in branding. Essentially, branding is kind of a great multiplier. It will help you to drive your CAC down, maybe even make negative CAC, where you get word of mouth, to the point where you don't spend as much marketing dollars in certain things. So essentially, yeah, it is branding, kind of accumulation of customer goodwill, uh, customer or emotional preference, essentially. And eventually, it will help you to differentiate in crowded space. So essentially, kind of, if you kind of simplify branding, is this so like, how people feel about your product, your company at the end of the day. Um, but at the same time, I think, one way to think about branding and positioning, um, I would probably consider using sort of like counter positioning approach, where you not just define yourself but also like define how you're better than your competitors, why actually people should choose you versus X, Y, and Z solutions that also play in the same space. So I think those type of things will definitely help you to kind of define yourself, define branding, and essentially will help you to win long run.
Totally agreed. You guys both sort of alluded to this, but branding in our space is very different than let's like say a lifestyle brand or like direct to consumer brand, where it's like someone like Coca-Cola, they're almost running more off like personality or defining, who their customers are and the lifestyle they live. Whereas I find those sort of like drinking the Kool-Aid kind of branding styles in the tech space, technical professionals are quick to sniff out marketing and run away from it. And some of those like old methods of branding don't necessarily work in our area. So how do you guys like to approach branding specific to the technical audience, knowing how skeptical they are? There has to be a heavy focus on authenticity, right? And maybe Paul, let's start with you this time.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what you mentioned about, example of Coca-Cola, but I mean, I can mention a few examples as well, or maybe some examples come in mind like tech space, like even maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was very common to see, companies throw big budgets at, Super Bowl ads, for example, and sort of like, gain momentum this way. And, you can, and again, you can use tooling, kind of see how their brand search spikes up and then kind of like, settles down, but still there was a lift. And I think those tactics, uh, were producing results maybe 10, 15 years ago. Right now, it seems to be sort of like, shift even like, last few Super Bowls. I don't think, at least like in my memory, I don't think I've seen like many tech companies actually even traditional advertisers kind of pulled back because I think, there is a realization that consumers became more savvy and it's even more true so when it comes to developers. Developers overall, I would say definitely probably the most or the savviest group of customers you can target. I can't think of any other segment in the marketplace that could be savvier than that. So and when it comes to trying to market to that group, obviously you have to be authentic. You cannot really fake it, and that's what it comes down to essentially. uh, how do you communicate with them? And in very very often it comes down to clear, transparent documentation for your APIs, build SDK, or offering sort of like free playground like sandbox for them where they can actually try. Because I think from that perspective, like you want to build that trust, and very often it does help to kind of open the kind of gates so developers can actually experience your product in some shape or form before making buying decisions. So I think when it comes to creating that or kind of starting that sort of like relationship with developers, you have to come from the point where you're very transparent, very open, but at the same time you uh uh, provide things that truly help to solve their problems. Because at the end of the day, uh, if your product, your solution does not make their life easier, then I'm not sure what else you really can do. So it kind of like around all those things. So I'm gonna probably pause right now and um, um,
Totally. We'll get in the details there too, but you're lining up. I have a client, I think he's on the call right now and makes fun of me, but I always joke like if a dev can't find your quick start guide, you've already lost them usually. Like you gotta make it easy for them to understand what you do well versus the competition. And yeah, I'm sure he's laughing right now because I've said it on about just every webinar we've had recently. Madhukar, what's your take on this? What defines like good branding when it comes to a technical audience and sort of focusing on that authenticity?
Yeah, I think everything Paul said, definitely I agree with. But taking a step back, I would say before we even get to branding, I feel let's define what is in a technical audience. What is the main role of marketing? And in my mind, I think it is to get the product in the hands of the right users as quickly as possible. And so if you approach it from that way, then it comes down to both distribution, like finding the right users, and then, of course, it's the messaging. And the messaging has to be truthful, authentic, straightforward, literal, no any, bombastic stuff. All of that is good. But my personal learning is that, and I'll tell you a story first, and then I'll tell you why I think that I see a lot more. So, I live in the Bay Area, and a few months, so I think about a year or so ago, there used to be somebody always knocking at the door and say, "Hey, do you want to install solar on your roof?" And I would immediately shut my door and not talk to the person. And then one day I was coming out of the house and I saw three of my neighbors had put in solar in their houses. And I literally went to them and said, "Why do you do it? How much did it cost?" And things like that. So the point of the story is when somebody tries to sell us, technical or not, we almost have walls come up because we have that immunity to sales and marketing. But we still value what our peers and people that we know of or that we respect tell us. Like even today, I got a LinkedIn message from one of my former colleagues and say, "Hey, look at this tool for outbound." And I immediately clicked on it because he said we used it and it works really well. So the point is, even for developers, they like to see what others have told them about the product versus the company itself talking about it. Right. So that again can only be enabled if you have put that product in the hands of the right people and the product is good enough that they are then going and talking about it. So word of mouth is a big part of it. From an official point of view, I do think that marketing to enterprises is slightly different. That's where the messaging truly comes in, but it has to be more educational and helpful versus more about features. Like the features today have become commodities. If you have something today, somebody else will come up with the same thing and something better tomorrow. So at the end of the day, it becomes about the messaging becomes of the identity of the user in many ways. Like the other example is Nike. They don't talk about shoes, they talk about athletes or people's identity of even if you're not an athlete, but who identify themselves as somebody who push harder and are disciplined and things like that. So those are some of the nuances of how I look at it and what really goes into a good branding for technical audiences.
Totally agree. We're all sort of focusing on the same things here, which is like branding in the technical space really going to be um, pushed by community, right? Developing and nurturing that community, how you're communicating versus via content and like what, the sort of all-encompassing DevRel strategies, right? So with those sort of like three focuses or like, and any of those channels you're using, how do you make sure that you're driving consistent brand message across each of those channels or tactics. So you really make sure you're pushing a unified front.
Yeah, at the so from again from a meta perspective, I first like to try and understand the identity of the true ideal customer user profile, right? And in enterprises, your user and buyer might be slightly different. At least it's been my experience. But the user always influences the buyer in many ways, like the head of the engineering and so on. And so the way I like to think about is from a brand perspective, if the product itself or the entire experience, if you personified it, what does that identity look like? And then try to come up with a messaging that kind of relates to it, right? So if you're, let's say, going after a database developer, or if you're going after a web developer, if you're going after a backend developer, there are nuanced identity differences, right? And one could be more visual, the other one could be more backend stuff with Go and Python and so on versus Next.js and so on. So then I would craft out what is the umbrella message for it, but tied to that identity. And that identity could be, something that's common across all developers, could be humorous, could be sarcastic, could be, very dry sense of humor, and then start to play around with those messages for the user. But again, the idea is to get them to identify with it and then use the product, not to say, oh, this is so great because, I'm just making fun of my competitor. And
Exactly.
that messaging, I think, once you do it, it becomes, if you do it often enough, it turns into a muscle memory in the team. And then you start to see the same things show up in your social, in your booth, and other places as well.
Totally. I totally agree. Paul, what's your take on make sure you're driving a unified branding message across your channels?
Um, yeah, just to add a little bit, maybe again, I mean, there are sort of like internal channels that you control, right? Like
Correct.
basically from the entry point to your landing page, then maybe a registration, a free trial, sandbox, and then the product itself. And you essentially have, I mean, typically you'd have a lot of control over those things. I think, from my experience, where it could be a little bit tricky, essentially because I mean, again, we're talking about, let's say, some marketing activity where, you may be working with content creators, influencers, or maybe social communities. And that's where I think, at least in my experience, uh, things can become a little bit tricky because you want to make sure that if you work with the influencers or you work with content creators, that they do serve you well in terms of like extending your brand messages without distortion, essentially, where what you trying to communicate to your users being projected correctly by the partners that you're working with. And I think that's where um kind of rubber hits the road in many cases. But I think at the end of the day, you have to do certain things to make sure that kind of goes back to what Madhukar mentioned, that the right person, that content creator or influencer actually does talk to the right ICP, the right person, whether it's maybe backend developer versus database developer, etc. So you have to basically dig in quite to understand like who you're going to target if you're going to partner with that influencer. And I think that's sort of like lays or kind of becomes um part of the kind of your strategy. How do you identify uh, potential partners that you can work with, that they can, amplify your message? Because again, it's one thing that you say that, yeah, your product can result, address this problem, in a effective way, etc. But it's another thing when another influencer or maybe another developer who is influencer actually vouches for you. It goes a long way. But you have to be very strategic and smart how you pick who you partner with. And also that kind of, when it comes to content creation, I think, and again, I'm seeing that in kind of affiliate space where, let's say we're working with a partner who creates content, but then down the road, we see that actually that content being quoted by different AI platforms. And that's also kind of becomes sort of like, that potentially you have to manage how essentially AI tools, perceive your product, because or what information they actually provide to the users who actually ask maybe AI tools about your product. So you kind of have to make sure that it's also consistent with your brand position. But again, I think if you're doing great job with your documentation, if you're doing the right thing when you work with content partners and influencers, I think it's going to come out as kind of unified message. So but last thing you want to do, like to hear, to create like different conflicting like messaging. So that's why it's kind of that alignment becomes super important.
I totally agree. I do really like the idea of engaging with the people that are already speaking about you, though. We tell clients all the time, it's like, go hop on YouTube and see who's already making tutorials about your product, or go talk to that client that is constantly in your customer service logs and engage with them and see how they're talking about you. And half the time, they would probably be open to like, writing blog posts for you, or like assisting with your DevRel, or sharing some information for your social media. It's a great outlet there. So, you talked about this, right at the when we opened the conversation today, Madhukar. But dev tool space and the technical space is getting really crowded these days. How do you go about standing out if you're in a particularly crowded market? Like, I feel like every year when I go to KubeCon, it's just there's like 20 more companies there when I show up, and it's just everyone's hopping onto very similar like service lines and models. If you're in one of those situations, what's your advice to those marketing leaders on defining your brand versus the competition?
Yeah, I think that's where the creativity meets technology comes into play, the left side and the right side. I used to say that, you have to be creative, come up with pattern breakers that's memorable, right? And that cuts across not just not just what you put out on your booth or in your billboard, but also how the product behaves. So it could be something, let's take an example of Slack. The Slack sound that you get of the horse clap, that is a memorable piece of branding, and it is memorable even if it was a very crowded space. So you have to find those little things that breaks the pattern and then makes people remember, oh, okay, I remember that because it was of this. And it could be anything. It could be messaging, it could be a tactic that you apply. But the problem with that is once everybody else starts to do it, it becomes absolutely useless. So it falls back into the use of the product and how good and the quality of the product. So it has to be done in a very measured and both ways, in the sense, yes, the product has to continue evolving and it has to be great. But at the same time, you need to find some new memorable moments that helps break the pattern of what other people are seeing. And then it sticks in your mind. Like the example I give is in the Bay Area, if you drive up or down 101 in the Silicon Valley, you'll see at least 100 different billboards. And I guarantee that after you've driven down there a few hundred times, you'll not remember one single billboard. And every one of them is paying 300 or $400,000 a year. The ones that you do remember are the ones that are pattern breakers. And then you would go and check it out. And this is an actual experience. We used to have at Single Store a billboard, and we used to put out like every month a very branded, humorous thing. And people started to talk about it on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and other places. And people who used to look forward to it and say, okay, what's coming up in the next month, and so on. And one of our biggest customers came from that. They said, I was driving by, I saw your billboard, it was hilarious. And that's when I called my CTO to say, go check out these guys and see what they do. But yeah, again, like I said, it has to be done in good measure and you have to continue evolving.
Totally agree. Anything to add there, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely crowded, and even in our space, maybe about a year ago, we've seen many competitors start using kind of AI language on their landing pages, etc. It's like, kind of overnight, like, suddenly everything is AI, etc. And and it kind of becomes like almost kind of like, copy and paste messaging in a way. uh and I think there is some truth to that, that eventually people become sort of like, immune to that. Even recently, I don't remember, I mean, unfortunately, I don't remember the name of the study, but I actually did see a study recently where it says that people, it wasn't developers, it just in general market, kind of like, maybe more B2B marketing, I would say. But essentially people who see, when they see AI messaging, they actually kind of trust less. However, if messaging is focused on the problem solving, then that's what actually kind of catches attention in reality. So sometimes, like, when it's crowded space, and very often it kind of becomes like, like 10 years ago or 15, everything was cloud. Right now, everything is AI. But at the end of the day, it kind of becomes sort of like all the same, and people kind of get confused and don't really kind of, at some point, they don't really care. They want to solve the problem. So I
Yep.
think, in our case, we kind of trying to stay grounded from that perspective. Yes, of course, we probably need to use some AI language in to kind of explain or communicate how product work. But at the same time, the main focus, how to actually solve problems for our customers. That kind of focus that we're trying to kind of uh, you know continue on. And I think long term is going to produce results, because you're not essentially shift in your strategy or messaging based on the kind of where wind blows, but you actually have vision, and essentially that vision is anchored basically on the problems that you're trying to solve for your customers. And I think that's what will kind of differentiate essentially from other potential players who actually not necessarily trying to chase something like short term without actually focusing on long term problem.
Could not agree more. I feel like technical marketing always comes back to education. It always comes back to who's informing me of what I need to know the fastest. Like there's always opportunity for personality. But we find that the most successful of the competition tends to be the ones that those technical audiences look to know I can go here to get the information that I need and get it quick. I love that you brought up AI messaging too, because like we're seeing the same. I'm even seeing it on the sales side. I'm calling it now like AI is going to drastically change cold outreach and outbound. You guys know as two leaders, like all the AI outbound tools right now are absolutely flooding every leader's inbox, and it's just completely killed outreach efforts. Like people are immune to it. They're scanning right through those emails, and brand is going to be even more important than it was before, and awareness via those like softer methods. So, sort of diving into pitfalls a little bit more, what are some of the other common branding pitfalls you see being, accidentally executed in the technical space? I always start with you, Madhukar.
Yeah, I would say just like what you mentioned, there's to me, I mean, if I take a step back, it is when when the finance team starts to make decisions about marketing, that's when you're a little bit in trouble because they're always looking at, and in their right, they're always looking at the cost benefit analysis. So if you do that, then you would look at email campaign and say, it's free, let's do more of it. Let's find 100 million people and start blasting emails. Or if you you subscribe to that thinking, you would be like, why do we need a $300,000 worth of billboard on such and such place? I don't see any attribution. So to me, that's one of the biggest pitfall because that leads you down to the path of attribution. And I say this to everybody that attribution is a fool's errand because it's not one touch that causes maybe sometimes somebody to become your customer. It takes multiple touches, as you know. So that's one. The second thing I would say is anything that is, very false in messaging. It's blatantly false and it comes out. And I'm not saying that it's very common, but we still see. I mean, yesterday I was reading about some company where they had put logos of companies that they were not even customers. And imagine what it would have done to their existing customers now. So those like that's like a self-inflicted wound, which is very easy to avoid in my mind. And then of course there are other things too, like some would focus a lot more on paid Google, where you're just driving your entire PLG by paying millions of dollars for signups. That's another mistake, both in terms of branding as well as in terms of overall business as well. So yeah, there's no general formula, but these three definitely come to mind when it comes to pitfalls of what not to do.
Totally agree, particularly on like being short sighted and not playing the long term game. Particularly in technical marketing, it's very, you got to have the stomach for it. And like you said, it's multiple touch points and being top of mind when they're ready to make that decision. All the time, I'll see people that just got their seed series or series A and they're just hiring more sales guys and more sales guys. Then they don't understand why they're getting these clients that don't want to renew because they just sort of were cramming round pegs into square holes. But then they'll be like, "Oh, we can't hire a DevRel guy for 150K a year. That's just too much. We can't spend that money." It's like, oh, okay, see how that works out for you in the long run. Paul, what's your take? What are some common pitfalls you're seeing?
Yeah, I think I would say like resist the hype and don't look for shortcuts. And again, one example that comes to mind, for example, study comes out and says like, okay, developers hang out on Reddit. So suddenly everybody has to have a Reddit strategy, or maybe Reddit shows up in Google search results, etc. It kind of another signal, oh my goodness, we don't have Reddit strategy. And then what happens next, that people try to hire somebody who can post or kind of create some kind of like, maybe kind of content on Reddit. But again, at the end of the day, it's you kind of follow the hype and kind of looking for a shortcut, but eventually it's going to backfire, because especially savvy customers like developers, they can see through that. So I think, in my mind, I think it's always better to kind of, again, perhaps you need Reddit strategy, but then it has to be uh, well thought through. It has to be authentic and real, not just basically paid post by somebody who doesn't even really know your product. It just not gonna work short term and even long term. So
Totally agree. We've sort of talked about this on our call a couple weeks ago. Is like the minute you start employing a Reddit strategy is almost the time when you almost ensure Reddit's not going to work for you. And like the whole, what makes Reddit such a unique tool to developers is that it's damn near impossible to effectively market on it. It's supposed to be authentic, it's supposed to be a place where you can go learn, ask questions, critique. And the minute you try and manipulate that into being a marketing tool in an inauthentic way is the minute Reddit will kick off the subreddit, like the users will boot you out of there. Like, we don't have time for this. Um, okay, so we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth diving into. So when it comes to branding based off personas, like you can approach this from the you know, end users versus, technical decision makers, or enterprise versus open source. But how do you guys approach the strategy of adjusting your brand messaging based off the persona or audience you're talking to? Paul, we'll let you have the first stab at this one.
yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a good question. So I think we definitely try to use different different approach for different segments and different communication channels as well, because if you, let's say, and again, I'm maybe talk more a little bit about influencers and kind of partners, because kind of it's kind of closer to my sweet spot, so to speak. But if you think about it, like, let's say, usage of YouTube influencers versus LinkedIn, like, I think there is a you know different approach, different strategy, because again, if you're looking about or thinking about something like, tutorial or long-term kind of or long shelf life content, definitely YouTube is the way to go. And again, there are YouTube channels that probably can identify that will speak to your audience, to your ICP, while, for example, on the other hand, like, LinkedIn channel could be something that, again, if you want to raise awareness for webinar, maybe doing for developers, etc., then maybe you can use essentially a different channel and different messaging for kind of different purpose. So we were trying to be very thoughtful about, again, who we're trying to target, for what reason, what we're trying to achieve. And that's why we're trying to kind of adjust our strategy, obviously. So not to, um, not to kind of have, like, crossed wires, where we're trying to talk to developers about long-term kind of project, etc., but using a channel that doesn't really kind of design for that, if it makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with what Paul says. I think in terms of channel, definitely buyers versus users. The buyers, that strategy is different, and the channel is different too. Like maybe on LinkedIn, you're doing micro events. The call to action is also slightly different. And the messaging is more around, typically, again, depends a lot on the product, but it's more around the company benefits versus if you are talking to a developer or individual user, the messaging is really try out the product, right? And that, in my mind, is not really messaging. It's how you get other people to really talk about that product so that you understand it's good for you to begin with. It makes your life easier. So I think that's the big difference. Is one is more user centric, while the other is more company centric, more benefits to the team and something related to revenue, because that's on the top of the mind for every buying persona right there in companies.
Totally agree. Okay, probably the hardest one to answer that we'll end on here. Measuring brand impact. I'd say sometimes like trying to measure brand impact can be a fool's errand. It sort of depends on what the company's goals are. We just talked about how it can be very soft. You need to be long-term focused. Sometimes measurement can make people very like short-term focused or short-sighted. So I'm curious to hear how you guys approach that internally. Some of our clients is almost more of like educating your fellow coworkers and leaders on the importance of branding versus trying to actually apply a number to it. Some companies do apply a number to their brand measures, but I would like to hear how each of you guys like to approach this from your various leadership perspectives.
Yeah,
That's,
Paul, you want to go?
we'll
Yeah,
let you. That's a hard one first.
yeah. I mean, yeah, it's not easy, but at the same time, I think a lot of businesses already tracking a lot of metrics that sort of like indirectly probably show the kind of branding effect, whether it's organic search or again, it could actually. I mean, most companies who do digital marketing already tracking that paid search versus organic search. And again, it could be and also depending on the keywords, etc., you can kind of dig in a lot into the data and understand essentially what is your mix, which may actually kind of give you a good indication how you're doing against your competition. Actually, very recently, I also saw a case study of Notion versus Monday, how essentially they kind of differ in terms of organic versus paid search. And you can clearly see, like, different companies have different strategies, and that's sort of like, and it has to do a lot with that, with their branding efforts. So I would say, like, yeah, we look into the kind of uh similar metrics that we use for other channels, search trends, social media mentions. At the same time, I think it's important to track also things that, like word of mouth advocacy. So do people um, send referrals your way, and at what rate? So I think it's going to be also like pretty good indicator in terms of how you kind of doing in terms of kind of your brand perception. At the end of the day, I think you can do like many more things, like even doing surveys, market studies, etc., where you can pretty good understanding where you are in the space. Because I think very often branding, kind of maybe has perception. It's kind of fuzzy. It's you cannot really measure, but I think you can put pretty good structure where you can, have pretty good understanding how you're doing in terms of kind of your brand perception versus competition, but also, it will kind of give you some ideas how you can influence that.
Yeah, the one thing I would add to this is there are KPIs and then there are indicators. I would never look at a brand score as a KPI, only as an indicator. And even as an indicator, I tend to not measure it ourselves. At least in my previous place, we used to have an independent party like Insight Partners. They have their own measurement of, brand awareness. And it basically is an assimilation of number of different variables. So you would look at web impressions, your SEMrush, domain authority. They would look at mentions in social media, mentions in press, and then they would, put their own weights, compare it with the other companies in that area, and then come up with a score. So it gives you an indication of where you are and whether you're moving in the right direction, but from the perspective of an independent third party. For ourselves, if as marketers, I've seen that once we start reporting numbers like, oh, this is a web traffic and these many MQLs, it quickly becomes us versus them because now you are managing the metrics and you're reporting the metrics, and people tend to, not look at that authentically, whether it is true or not. So that's how I feel that, personally, I would look at, to me, the best indicator is organic traffic coming to your website. And if it's going up and it constantly goes up, that's a pretty good indication that people are finding you. And if you're spending a lot less over a period of time on paid, then that's an even bigger indicator that you're doing much better. Other than that, I think, looking at the campaigns, how they're doing, or the entire funnel, that's helpful. And also the ads, if you're doing in terms of paid. what is the actual conversion, the CAC, and so on. But to me, I honestly don't pay a lot of attention to the quote unquote vanity metrics or even report on those. Personally, I just look at the website organic traffic to see if that's stable, going down, or going up.
Totally agree. Love that you guys both focus on like bigger picture metrics. I always, you've all been on those teams that sort of death by metrics, and they're looking at so many numbers that the message gets lost in just the sheer amount that you're trying to measure. Yeah, KPIs, like I see those get abused all the time of where like they're talking about their goals for that quarter, and there's like a list of 30 initiatives, and then the indicators are like there's like 10 to 15. I'm like, how are you pulling any true information out of this and making decisions on it? So staying high level and not being reactionary is
Just
typical.
wanna add a couple of things. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think one thing that could be potentially helpful to kind of, because I mean, at the end of the day, brands should kind of help to address some friction in your funnel, basically. Because again, if you can measure if people who came from branded search, do they convert better versus your maybe other keywords of funnel? Do they spend more money? Those also could be indicators that kind of show that your branding does provide that value that essentially people trust more and they're willing to spend more money or they convert faster. Um, so those type of things also could be interesting metrics to track if you can.
totally agree. Totally agree. So now would normally be the time we dive into Q&A, but we had a really quiet audience today. No one left any questions in the chat. Must be a rough work week for our audience this week. But I guess we'll just end on one final takeaway. If you guys had like just one like key recommendation that you would make to everyone when it comes to branding, and then we'll just end on that last little bit here. Thanks everyone for joining today. Before we answer this last question, definitely check out the website if you guys need help with technical marketing content or want to check out our next webinar. Also, follow the links to both Madhukar and Paul's profiles. They both work at great organizations and are great social followers to stay up to date on the latest in technical marketing. So with that, guys, what's sort of like one last main takeaway you'd like to give everyone on branding? We'll start with you, Paul.
Yeah, I think kind of going back to probably what I mentioned at the beginning, thinking about counter positioning, because again, like I said, it's really crowded space. You're competing against probably some companies with deep pockets, but also there are many new startups that trying to go after the same audience. So at the end of the day, try to develop counter positioning because you have to kind of create sort of like really good reason why people should choose your product versus 10 other products that potentially in the marketplace. And I think that's, and again, once you define your counter positioning, it will help you to stand out more, but also if you have your team, marketing team or sales team or other teams to kind of equip them with a strong messaging that probably will help you to just win more customers long term.
Love it. What's your final takeaway, Madhukar?
Yeah, for me, it is, I think, as it gets more crowded, it has to be more product centric branding. And when it comes to product centric branding, it has to be, the entire experience has to be memorable. And of course, the product needs to be phenomenal for that to be authentic. But yeah, in my mind, I think I've seen that there was a time where people would talk about very lofty things like the reason why my company exists, we want to make a dent in the universe, and I talk a lot about the why. I think those days are gone. It is more about this is the product, try it out, and if it works for you, go talk about it to others. And that's where I think is the world is moving towards now.
Could not agree more. Thank you both for joining today. It was a great conversation. As noted in the chat, we'll be following up with the recording in the coming days. Otherwise, see everyone in the next one. Thank you, Madhukar. Thank you, Paul. Have a good one, guys.
So
See you later.